Hello, and welcome to Cutting Through. I'm Mitchell Plitnick. It took me a couple of days after reading the, uh, I guess, long-awaited national security strategy from the Trump administration. This is something that usually comes out much earlier in a president's term, first or second term. But it finally did come out this past week, and I read it, and yeah, I needed a few days before I was going to respond to it. It's every bit as horrifying as I thought it would be. But I was surprised by just how extreme the language was and the tone was. It's not that there's all that much in it that was really surprising if you've been paying attention to Trump's policies since the second term began. I don't think there's a lot there that's all that shocking. Um, but the tone was less they how shall I describe the normal tone of Trump's sort of official public facing documents reads like Trump worked on it and his minions did what they did, and then there were some professionals who went in and cleaned up some of the language just so that it sounded more presidential or governmental. That didn't happen here. This thing reads like a Stephen Miller wet dream. And it also reads like a Twitter rant in a lot of places. It's just d- d- horrifyingly blunt in its way of presenting. The opening of the document, for example, just basically reads like something that we've all heard at Trump campaign speeches that you've seen on the news. It railing on about immigrants, railing on about how woke and DEI were taking over and ruining the country. There was a lot about how horrible things have always been in the United States for, everybody's entire life until Donald Trump came along to fix it all. This is the typical stuff that you hear at his rallies that he says in public all the time. But it just went on in the way that he, again, does at his rallies. It's typical for his rallies. It's not as typical for these sorts of documents from the Trump administration. Obviously, it's not typical of what you usually get out of the American government, which is, you know, whatever else it may be, is usually somewhat more polished. Zateo's write-up, which is worth reading, by the way. Uh, in their write-up, they said that they spoke to a staffer in the federal government who said that it reminded them of fascist internet trolls getting worked up about something they saw on Twitter. It really does have that feel. Um, so, in that sense, it's just a reflection of who Trump is and what we're dealing with. But also, I think it's a reflection of how much the few restraints he might have had maybe in his first term have been completely removed. And we again, nothing new there. We've seen that since the second term began. Um, but uh, but seeing it in the national security strategy is a bit disconcerting, I have to say. Uh, One of the main themes is that the Trump administration is going to restore America's spiritual and cultural health. And I think this is very telling because a lot of this national security strategy is looking inward. A lot of it, usually national security strategy is about foreign policy. It's why people like me look forward to reading it so that we have a grasp of what the administration's thinking is. It doesn't necessarily always translate into actual policy on the ground, but you see what they're trying, what sort of strategy they're trying to pursue publicly. Um, But here, it's really a lot of this is about looking inward, and then, again, it goes on and on about how Trump fixed woke and fixed DEI and the horrible effects that those things supposedly had. Um, and of course, when he's talking about our spiritual and cultural health, What is he talking about? He's talking about nationalism. He's talking about the sort of the American spirit, if you will. And that spirit is, of course, very much a white nationalist spirit. That is how he defines it. That is how his people look at it. Now, somebody may look at that and point to this black person or this Indian, like, for example, Kash Patel, um, and other, non-white people who are involved in the MAGA movement, but we all know these are exceptions. These are very, very. These are people who are there in very small numbers, and in the 21st century, racism has taken on a bit of nuance where they will accept certain people of color as long as those people of color will completely buy into the ideology and therefore use their own race as a way of selling white supremacy, which is, I think, perfectly describes Kash Patel. Um, so that's a strong theme, and as you might imagine, this is very much connected, quite intimately, to immigration and that whole question. And we're going to get deeper into that in a minute. But one of the other things that the so-called president of peace spent some time in, which is actually, I guess, in a sense, foreign policy, is the attempt to combat cartels. And with this, he's talking about asserting more dominance in the seas, naval dominance, and we're seeing that, of course, play out right now with the attacks on Venezuela and the offshore buildup there, and his essential renewal. He calls it a sort of a corollary of the Monroe Doctrine, that he spends the document spends some time on, basically saying we rule the Western Hemisphere and we will not tolerate any outside influence at all, which, in a sense, is the spirit of the Monroe Doctrine. But in the 21st century, James Monroe lived in a very different time, and as much of a monster as he was, um, the context was very, very different. And what he's talking about now is, of course, China primarily, and Chinese influence around the globe, which they pursue through soft power as opposed to more direct and brutal ways that the United States does it. And that again is a recurring theme throughout the document. Trump also talks about how, ideally he would want to cooperate with Beijing and find ways to make everybody rich, as his usual line. But there's a very clear theme in everything in this document, is that America must be number one. Now that is not unusual for a national security strategy. Um, that theme was there in Joe Biden's NSS. It was there in Barack Obama's NSS. How does America stay on top? I mean, that is kind of the president's job description, whatever the ideology. But in Trump's framing, it takes on a much more white supremacist and white nationalist, I think, more importantly, uh, white nationalist kind of cast. There's some talk about free speech, which is, I mean, obviously problematic when we're talking about the Trump administration. We've seen that speech is not free under Donald Trump. Um, he continued and intensified the crackdown on free speech in opposition to genocide in Gaza. That was started by Joe Biden. Let us not forget, Democrats do not have clean hands on this issue at all. Um, and in fact, Democrats right now are actually, as anybody who knows, who watched my video on Sarah Hurwitz, and who heard what Hillary Clinton had to say, Democrats are by no means innocent here. But Trump has intensified that crackdown to the point of deporting people who spoke out about Palestine. Uh, but it goes farther than that. We see, the Charlie Kirk stuff that went on, and just in general, the attempt to get talk show hosts and TV shows off the air because they say things critical of Trump. I mean, clearly free speech is not a real value here. But what they're talking about in terms of free speech is what J.D. Vance was talking about when he admonished Europe. the whole continent, on the grounds of free speech because Europe tends to be more police more strongly the concept of hate speech than we do here. And of course, hate speech is the purview of the right, as much as they like to pretend that this is a both sides thing. It ain't. Never was, never will be. Not to say that sometimes left wingers do not go off the rails. It happens. Um, it's not unheard of by any means, but it is ideologically something the left is opposed to, whereas it is ideologically something the right encourages. That's just the way. That's just the fact. It's the fact of these ideologies, and all you have to do is look at the ideologies to know that. So, we're not here talking about true free speech. We're talking about the sort of anti quote unquote cancel culture that says that you shouldn't be just free to denigrate women, people of color, Jews, Muslims, Arabs, whoever, um, without any consequences. Europe takes a somewhat different approach to that than the United States does, where the United States has cultural consequences. Europe actually has laws against hate speech that are much more stringent than anything we have here. So that's why that was aimed there, but conceptually, it holds for everyone. Now, they also expand the definition of speech, which we certainly have been pioneers in, and talked about things of lobbying and also how communications are regulated. This was clearly meant to protect tech companies, Google, Twitter, Facebook, etc. That is very clearly what they're saying here. That they are standing against many of the regulations and the many of which have to do with privacy that Europe has instituted. The United States is far behind in that, and they're clearly targeting that to open up more of our information, our data to not only tech firms but to the growing AI field, which is a virtual obsession with Donald Trump. The document also rejects the whole concept, really, of international institutions. Um, it doesn't call for abolishing the United Nations, or anything like that. But it very clearly sets out a vision of the world and explicitly talks about relying not on international standards, but on individual states pursuing their own interests. So basically, as I noted in a video, I guess last week, it's promoting uh, a Hobbesian chaos world that we don't address. That instead of addressing, we embrace it and we defend it uh, against anyone who would try to change that. So that's going to be more desirable when you're the United States and you can push everyone else around, of course. But even for us, I don't agree that that is the best kind of world to live in. It's a hostile world. It's an angry world. It's a world of misery and uh, and poverty and great suffering in many, many places. And that's why these international institutions were thought of. I mean, it may not be exactly why they exist anymore. And that's a problem that we all need to work on. But it's certainly why they were considered. It's why they were dreamed of. And that is something that the Trump national security strategy stands squarely against. Obviously, there's a strong focus on American superiority, but there's also an underlying tone of not only harshness, but not only a need, but of real master race kind of feeling. Like we are Americans, therefore we are better than you. It's something certainly many Americans and people of some other nationalities at least have come to believe at various times in history and maybe even believe today. But given America's position in the world that it still holds, so many levers of power, militarily, economically, um, it's very, very dangerous and kind of scary to read it in this document. Um, there's tons of double standards here, of course. They talk a lot in the document about how the U.S. will use its cultural, economic, and in some cases, military influence in other countries to promote our interests. And this is very, very important. It's always to promote our interests. It's never, ever to promote our values or democracy or freedom or any of that stuff that other national security strategies from both parties historically have put forth those ideas in various different ways in different language. I'm not necessarily talking strictly here about the George W. Bush, democracy at the point of a gun idea, but this is something that's been there in other places. And but here it's much more interest driven. It's much more profit driven. Um, and at the same time, there's a great deal of hyperbole in this document about other countries influencing us. And that's clearly not just China. That's any other countries. Particularly, I think countries that might infect us with liberal ideas. So it's clearly a tone and a tenor that is meant to communicate strong ultra-nationalist fervor. And that's really a lot of what this document is. Um, there are points at which, and I think this quote kind of sums up a lot of what's in the NSS, that the U.S. opposes elite-driven, anti-democratic restrictions on core liberties in Europe, the Anglosphere, and the rest of the democratic world, especially among our allies. That should really send a chill down your bones. It's one of the few areas where there is a bit of language massaging. The double speak about implying the defense of democracy, which is absolutely not what they're talking about. They're talking about white supremacy. This is said in the context of both free speech and immigration. The document is dedicated to stopping migration, not just here, but as a global phenomenon. Basically, it's saying poor people stay in your countries and starve. And we're saying that, of course, this is nowhere to be found in the document, but we're saying that to countries whose resources we have stolen, which is why they're starving. Or exploited. Not even, we want to not use stolen, we can just use exploited and therefore drained. Um, Resources that are still being drained, resources that are being exploited. This is particularly true in Africa, but it's true all over the world, that are still being exploited by international corporations that are mostly run by people in the United States and Europe, mostly where most of the stocks are. And those corporations are draining those resources for people right in front of their eyes as they can't afford food and shelter. And they're looking at these resources being taken to line the pockets of billionaires. That's the world that drives migration, and it's a world that Trump does not want to address. If he was serious about wanting to stop migration, people don't want to leave their homelands. People don't want to leave, on the whole, people don't want to leave their homes. People tend to be attached to their homelands. But if their homelands are hopeless places where they cannot make a living, then yeah, they want to leave if they can't feed their children. The last point I'll make is there is no hiding in their Middle East section, which devotes remarkably little space to Israel, barely a mention. But they do talk a lot about how they will support the dictatorships in the Middle East. It says a few pro forma words about how they might be thinking about sort of reforming in some small ways, but they said they're not going to push that. And they're going to say, we will respect their cultural differences, as if millions and millions of people want to live under brutal dictatorships that are backed by enormous amounts of U.S. weapons. But that's a cultural difference, is the idea. So we're not supporting dictatorship. We're supporting their freedom to choose to live as nearly as slaves. It is a frightening document. Most of what's in there is already there in front of your eyes. It's not that there's any new policies that are really being revealed here, but it is a tone, and it lays bare, like I said, a Stephen Miller wet dream. It lays bare the white nationalism at the core of the Trump administration, and does so in such a shameless way that it's almost like reading Mein Kampf. It's just like reading, you know, any dictator's basic, diary, really, where they're really opening up their thoughts and this is how they see the world. Um, Most people aren't going to read this. So they feel free to say these things in a very explicit manner because I suspect most of the people who do read it are going to be their followers and, people who do this for a living, like myself. Um, but it is a chilling document, and I'm not saying you need to read it, but you do need to understand that what it is an explicit statement of a pursuit of a white nationalist agenda uh, that would leave many Americans and certainly much of the rest of the world in an even worse place. We're talking about, not just capitalism on steroids. We're talking about capitalism with the worst aspects of feudalism and just just you know every uh anti-human frankly impulse that you can think of. It is a nightmarish document. So just more reason to try and build a realistic alternative, and yet another reason why the weakness of Democrats is so intolerable, and the defense has to be something better than returning to the status quo that led us here in the first place. uh And hopefully we're starting to see that sort of understanding take root in the United States, because if it takes root here, it'll take root around the entire world, at least around the entire Western world, global North. So if you find this useful, please like, subscribe, and share with your friends. If you can donate and become a paid subscriber, or make a one-time donation, this is how I make my living. So uh, please do support this work if you can, and more soon.